We are now joined by a very special guest on the podcast. We've had interviews with authors before, but this one's a little extra special because this is Michael Powell, who is the author of a book called Canyon Dreams. You see it right here. This book is one that our chairman, Clay Bennett, gave all of us here at the Thunder Business Office at the start of the season. And when you say basketball, our ears perk up. So we were really excited about this book.
Yeah, I think we're always interested in learning about the game of basketball and in its many forms throughout the United States. And I think particularly during Native American Heritage Month, this is a story about as Michael described, Rez Ball, reservation ball, and the opportunity for us to just learn about a style of the game that's happening that maybe most people wouldn't know about. I found very fascinating. And so, Michael, thank you for joining us and maybe sharing a little bit of what you've learned.
Yeah, well, I came to this book in a very kind of almost roundabout way, like 25 years ago. My wife is a nurse midwife, and she was working on the Navajo reservation for a couple of months. And so I went out there with my then very young kid. And, and I'm a born and raised New Yorker. So I figured, okay, let me go out and play some hoop. And this is going to be kind of lazy country boy hoop, like not too, no big deal. I'd show what a New Yorker knows, like go to the stuff. I had my head handed to me. And I'd love to say it was just because I was playing at 6,000 feet, but it wasn't. I mean, at ocean level, I would have been in a great deal of trouble. I mean, it was just this rapid fire game. I mean, we were playing full court, and it was just up and down, it was like, kind of the old Phoenix Suns, but
seconds or less. Yeah.
Yes. Almost on hyper speed and, going to the hoop, a lot of emphasis on jumping. It was a somewhat different game than certainly see in New York. It's less of a vertical game and a little more horizontal. I mean, like a lot of speed and that kind of stuff, and less dunking and that kind of stuff. Not a problem for me as I don't dunk. But, so then, some years later, I went up there. I was a sports columnist for the Times, New York Times. And I went up there. I was out there for the Super Bowl in Arizona. And I decided, okay, let me get away for a couple of days. So I went up there in search of Rez Ball. And it was just this, I remember I drove up there from Phoenix. I got in, around 7:00 at night. And this entire parking lot of the high school was filled along with cars parked along the side of the road. You go inside, it's about 25 degrees out that night. There's 5,000 people in there for a high school basketball game, not a championship game, just another, Wednesday night in Fort Defiance. And, and you saw everyone there. I mean, grannies, aunties. I mean, it's just this, and then I guess also the level of sophistication, frankly, of the fans. I mean, they would be yelling out, back screens and this, and, I'm talking about like aunties, old grandmothers in their traditional clothing. And it just fascinated me. It was like opening a window into this culture that, basketball aside, fascinated me, and finding this world I didn't expect.
Well, you paint a beautiful picture of, first and foremost, just the landscape and the earth. And obviously this book is set in Arizona, but I think here in Oklahoma, we have all of this natural beauty here as well. So I guess what were your inspirations in terms of the way that you tried to paint portraits throughout the book? I mean, you do that with the landscape, but you do it with the people too. I'm thinking about Raul Mendoza, the head coach of Chinle. Maybe kind of describe the way that you were trying to show rather than tell.
Sure. I mean, and thank you. And I mean, that was my hope. And what I wanted to do with the book was use basketball as kind of a window onto this larger culture and history. And so that, yes, of course, I mean, there's this terrific coach who's himself not a Navajo, but from a tribe in southern Arizona and northern New Mexico, the Tono O'odham. But also, kind of getting at this larger culture. So going into religion, going into the politics of water. I mean, a lot of the things that, as you know, play out throughout your region. And I wanted to try to do it as much as I could through the story, through stories, so that it didn't become like this didactic, here's, the problem with the water thing, or here's the problem with, whatever. Look, the Navajo Nation, as many is true of many Native Americans, struggles with things like alcohol, and drug abuse. But I didn't want to have it just, again, to be kind of one of these where I'm like, coming in from the outside and kind of wagging my finger, even if I'm doing it sympathetically. I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to try to tell the story through these kids, their parents, their grandparents. I befriended or had the good luck to befriend a medicine man who, kind of gave me a lot of insight into that. And anyway, it was just, so I was trying to describe a world in the whole through hoops.
Yeah. And I love how you used basketball as that vessel to be able to kind of explain the Navajo Nation and also the people within it. But I think it's so interesting how basketball can do that, particularly for this area. Can you just describe the meaning of Rez Ball on the Navajo Nation in particular?
It's amazing. I mean, you will talk to, I described, right? So you've got these multi-generational families coming, and I'll get talking to a number of times a granny or a grandfather, and they played hoop. They played like for that high school, and their grandparents played, and it's just, I remember when I went out there 25 years ago, so that was before really the internet had arrived out there. There was just, even then, there were baskets. There's baskets, if you can, if there's the back of a cactus, on the back of they're just everywhere. And it is, in fact, actually, I remember this calls of mine 25 years ago or 30 years ago, I figured, okay, I wanted to catch the NBA finals, and the Phoenix Suns were in it that year, as a matter of fact. So, a couple of Navajos I'd become friendly with told me, oh yeah, you can get it on this station and everything. So I set myself up with my chips and everything and turned it on. And yes, it was indeed the game, and it was all in Navajo. So the only words I understood were like Charles Barkley or, but that also kind of gets at the intensity of it. They have Navajo, only broadcasts of the game. They have games in English that are broadcasted. And everybody, I'd go off for a hike during the day and, get talking to people I know, and they say, well, I gotta go because I gotta get back to my, either they'd go into the game or they'd go back to their, whatever, their van or their mobile home, and they would listen to the game. It's this enormously cohesive thing. And I guess one last thing was that I was talking with I think he was a UPS driver, Navajo, but who had been a star like 20 years ago, right? And he said to this day, he will be driving along and all of a sudden somebody will pull up alongside him in the passing lane and start beeping and get him to pull over so that they can take a picture with him. It's just this level of intensity.
We have a player on the Oklahoma City Thunder named Lindy Waters III, who is actually from Norman, Oklahoma, but he is part Kiowa and part Cherokee, and one of, I think, the only Native American players in the entire NBA. And something that he talks about to us is, this intentionality of not losing the heritage. And it's, something that you really put forth in the book is all of these kids who are, they're investing in the game of basketball, which is, an American sport, but, they're broadcast in Navajo, and, before games, they're listening to rap music, but they also have, totems on them and things to try to carry. So how did you, I guess, try to describe this juxtaposition of, these Native American folks who are taking part in a very, sort of Western game, so to speak, in basketball, but maintaining their traditions and their cultures?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And that's, and you would run into this all the time, right? I mean, they would, they listen, as my sons do, to Kanye, Jay-Z and all of Kendrick and all this sort of stuff. But at the same time, they're wrapping bee pollen and other things inside their socks, and they're, they will spread aromas within their, locker room. And there is this, I mean, I don't want to, paint an uncomplicated picture. It is complicated, right? There's more. 25 years ago, before the internet, there was, everybody spoke Navajo. I mean, if you ran into a 25-year-old, they spoke Navajo. Now, like these kids, they all they speak some of it, right? But they kind of speak it to talk to their grannies and their, but so there is a sense of like kind of the outside world, kind of impinging. And I don't even know if it's bad or good. It's just, it's life, right? That's just, and look, if these kids want to go out into that broader world, obviously they need, some of that. So I was trying to kind of catch that point, right, where there is this kind of inflection point, and it's a big, for instance, on Navajo right now, to be president of the Navajo Nation, one must be fluent in Navajo. And there's been a couple of really good young candidates who have had to drop out of races because they can't speak fluent Navajo. Clearly, at some point, I don't want to inject myself into Navajo politics, but clearly at some point, they're going to have to figure this out, right? Because you don't, it's this massive area. It's the size of West Virginia. And, you need these like great young people, like the Kiowa, the, Cherokee, you need, your guy. I mean, those relationships. So it's a real, it's a complicated struggle for them. And I was trying to kind of get at that. But there is this, kids would talk, they weren't like trying to, pretend. They would talk about like, one of the young guys who's the point guard would go out for a run every morning. He was a long distance runner, another very big sport on the Rez. And he would go up on top of a butte, or a mesa, and, do his absolutions to the sun as it came up. I mean, in the Navajo beliefs. So it's this really, complicated, interesting, rich culture.
I'm curious too, because it's the story itself of the team and their journey. Don't want to give any spoilers on the podcast for those who might not have listened to the book, but that journey with this team is very moving. Like you find yourself like enraptured in it a little bit. And the thing that I found really interesting was the role that Raul Mendoza played in this, and just it seems like his importance among this group of young people. Just, can you describe him as a coach and what you witnessed with him, with these kids?
Sure. I mean, he's one of the like kind of grand old men coaches, right? I mean, he's coached for like 35 years out there. He's not, as we say, he's not Navajo himself. He's from another tribe, but he's married to a Navajo woman. Obviously his kids are, half Navajo. And he very intentionally takes on, kind of that he's, I mean, as I think is probably true of all great youth coaches, right? High school, college, like that you're raising young men, right? That you're not just trying to win this championship. So he would, and at times, I mean, early in the season, he did things, to make points. Kids would start throwing a tantrum or whatever, and he'd bench people, and, he'd lost a couple games that way. But the idea was that over time you build, and he's the winningest coach, in the history of the Rez right now. But the pressure also is intense. I mean, they started to have they lost a couple games in January, and now it's the season starts in November. It's but by January, you're not supposed to be losing games. And, people would come up to him and, the laundromat, I was with him a couple of times, and, start telling him what he needed to do. And, and there'd be grumbling, and there's a chat room now, where people going back and forth. It's a tough, but he was a great character, because he did have this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of self-knowledge that made him somewhat kind of impervious to that, to all the stuff.
Seemed like he had to do a lot of listening, and had to hold court sometimes to just make sure everybody felt heard, because there's such investment among the entire community for that sport.
Oh yeah, and if you're a kid, there is a point in the book where a kid who had been a big star in middle school and came from a pretty rural, much of the Rez is rural, but he came from a really rural part. And, he had his whole family would show up. And when I say family, 25 people, right, would show up to these games, and he wasn't playing. And, the family came down afterwards and was just in his face, and they had to, the coach that night, when, was there until midnight, talking with the grandmother, who was absolutely, felt her honor had been displayed. And, it's intense. And I think that's one of the things he also tries to work on, is that intensity is a lovely, wonderful thing. But this kid, even if he was really good, most kids aren't going to be your guy, right? Who made the, so it's how do you convey that you want that intensity, but also that just a little bit more perspective.
Right.
Yeah. And just a couple more questions for you, because we really want people to be able to read this book and get everything that we've downloaded from it. There's just so much packed in here. But the one thing that throughout the entire book, behind this backdrop of following this basketball team, is just the beauty of northern Arizona and this 17 million acre reservation, which is gigantic. It spans across multiple state lines, right? If I'm not mistaken.
3 states: New Mexico, Utah, and Arizona. Yeah.
And there's just canyons and so much geographical beauty juxtaposed with, struggle and a little bit of hardship as well. What did you experience while you were there, just in terms of taking in that natural beauty? What was it like just being in that area?
It was just an honor. I don't know how to put it. It was just I love to hike and walk, and, there's just so many spectacular kind of canyons and the natural beauty. Everything is, the Chusca Mountains, I'm going to probably blow this one way, and the Black Mesa and the other, and one was male, one was female, and these, in their cosmology. And it's just so you feel so kind of, you're not just hiking, you're hiking in this land that's been Navajo since, at least the 13th century. And, so it was spectacular. And then, you go hiking, and I remember, one point I'm in the bottom of this canyon, and, I climb up on kind of this black sand dirt thing. And, all of a sudden they came upon, the handprints, where people would 7 centuries earlier, left their handprints and stuff. And it was just, it was very moving. There was just this sense of kind of, of being like in the United States, but also not in the United States, in this other world. And, look, it has, as we know, it has its struggles and it has great poverty and there's all these problems, but there is at its richest, there's this intense connection to the land. And it is why some of the kids struggle sometimes when they get out, not because, necessarily they're having alcohol problems or they're not good students. It's this very intense kind of thing. And to kind of leave that and go to Oklahoma City, to go to Albuquerque or, something can feel disorienting.
You also, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, you really lay out the history too of how these reservations came to be, the frankly horrific policies and violence that occurred that created this situation. And so you do a really nice job of juxtaposing, the reason why these places even came to be in the first place, in addition to maybe the richness and the beauty of what these human beings have made of their circumstances.
Yeah, there was this disorienting moment. I remember at some point when I was walking down into Canyon de Chelly, which is this beautiful canyon and kind of a spiritual center of that res. And I realized at some point that when I was a kid, I had a book on Kit Carson. And I remember it was about how he was fighting Native Americans in this canyon with all these, the cliffs, and it was all, and as a kid, it all kind of seemed, very romantic, like, oh, there's these people living all up in the cliff. And it occurred to me, it was here. And these were, Kit Carson was sent to root out, the Navajo from their traditional, and they were, as they fought him, they were kind of hiding further and further back into the canyon. And and it just kind of, it took me aback at that point, to kind of realize that, and of course they had their own, as did the Cherokee, they had their own Trail of Tears. They were forced out into the desert southeast of Albuquerque. One of the things I liked about their tale is that they did, like when you're on the Navajo res, they got it back, and they did it slowly. They just kind of they were allowed to go back and just sort of take a small chunk. And now, it's probably like 85% of their historic lands, they live on. And that's a triumph, right? I mean, that's, as we know, that is not the typical, story of Native Americans. And some of that's luck. Some of it's that it was seen as wasteland, right? It's high desert. Nobody wanted to live there. And then they also had some really good leaders who, over time, slowly kind of negotiated their way back onto this land. But there is, so embedded in this story is a kind of a triumph, an historical triumph.
And you really tell this story so beautifully, just the backdrop of the beauty juxtaposed with the struggle, the triumph of basketball, and also the sadness and of loss. And there's just so much interwoven in this book, and you tell it beautifully. Michael, thank you so much for sharing the book with us, the story with us, but also joining us on the podcast.
Of course. No, it's been my pleasure. It's been a lot of fun.
And for those who don't know, like we said, the book is called Canyon Dreams, a basketball season on the Navajo Nation. You can find it anywhere you get books. So go check it out.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, really appreciate it.
What a fun interview. Well, that wraps up today's episode. We want to thank you so much for watching and listening. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Thank you so much to our special guest, Michael Powell. Thank you so much to our producer, Matt Bishop. And until next time, thunder up and catch you later.